Hey there, and welcome to the Jeffrey Van Dyke Show, a podcast for paradigm changers. Each week I speak with another influential leader who's changing the conversation for their audience, their industry, and this world. I am so glad you're here. Welcome to the show. Hello there, and welcome to the Jeffrey Van Dyke Show. Today we have with us Junot Diaz. He is an author, a writer, and most of all, an artist. We speak deeply about the role of the artist, the path of the artist, and the necessity for the artist's voice in each one of us for the collective imagination of a new future. Junot was born in the Dominican Republic, raised in New Jersey. He's the author of the critically acclaimed book Drown and The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which won the 2008 Pulitzer and the National Book Critics Circle Award, as well as This Is How You Lose Her, a New York Times bestseller and National Book Award finalist. He's the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, Penn Malamud Award, Dayton Literary Peace Prize, Guggenheim Fellowship, and Penn O. Henry Award. He's a graduate of Rutgers and is currently the fiction editor at Boston Review and the Rudge and Nancy Allen Professor of Writing at MIT. I'm really looking forward to sharing this conversation with you. I hope you enjoy it. Junot, thank you so much for being with us. Preparing for this conversation, a lot of the folks that I talk to are in a variety of industries, and you're an academic, you're an intellectual, and my experience of you is you're an artist. I'm wondering, for people that aren't familiar with your work and what you're up to in the world, I'm curious how you'll even answer this. What would you say your work is? How do you see it?
First, Jeffrey, thank you so much for having me, and really appreciate it. I think it's an interesting thing where I'm a literary artist. I'm a writer. I write fiction. I'm interested in fiction as an art, not simply as a kind of a way to keep myself in pennies or to kind of keep myself in busy. I've also been an activist most of my adult life. And, this was before corporations got into activism as sort of rabidly as they are involved in now. I spent most of my youth doing police brutality work, both in New York City and the Dominican Republic. And more than anything, I am an educator. I'm a university professor. I would scarcely say I'm an academic, and if I am, not because there's anything wrong with being academic, it's just because if I am, I would be a poor one, since I'm not on campus enough to sort of qualify. But I think I would begin with those as the sort of the broad outlines.
Mm-hmm. There's a few places that I want to go in this conversation. So there's your work as a writer, and then there's your work as a change maker or an activist. The conversations around race, white supremacy, masculinity, the relationship between those, around the role of the artist as a change maker in the world. But I want to start here. To me, a lot of what I look at is how we were raised and the challenges that we went through and the wounds we experienced shaped our voice and shaped what we do in the world and really shape our purpose. What can you tell us about how you were raised?
Yeah, well, I had a sort of two kind of a step childhood. I would argue book one was I first was raised in the Dominican Republic until I was 6 years old, raised primarily by my grandparents. My father was in the United States, working, doing that kind of immigrant thing. My mother was in the Dominican Republic working to keep the family going. She worked a lot didn't really see her quite as much as one would want. So raised by my grandparents first and foremost, and raised with this sense of a missing father. Now, it's hard to exaggerate how important patriarchy was and fathers were in the Dominican Republic in the 70s when I was growing up. Not having a father was literally like walking around in a Christian universe without a soul. It just didn't make any, it kind of really felt like an enormous deficit, and people made you feel that way. And certainly I grew up with enormous longings and desires to have my father, to know my father. And these were times before the internet, before easy texting, before you could get photographs. I didn't even know what the United States looked like. I'd never even seen a map of the United States. Then the second part of my life was growing up in New Jersey after our father brought us over, brought me and my siblings and my mother over. And that was from 6 and on. And I got to say, I can't decide which one was harder. Was it growing up without my father and that enormous longing of a child, or growing up with my father to discover that my father was this very, very dictatorial person? My father was a military man for life, very, very authoritarian, very brutal, and a very difficult person. And that, I think, begins my challenges, right? Being an immigrant, of course, in the United States at a time where, rarely is immigration welcome, but certainly it was acutely a time of a lot of xenophobia. And then I had this father, and in some ways, the kind of challenges of America folded into the challenges of my father. It was like I was fighting two people at the same time. It was kind of bananas.
Yeah. And did you box?
My father was an
Were you a
avid boxer. Absolutely
All
avid.
right. I saw your hands moving, and I was like, wait.
Yeah, that showed no
too.
skill. That was more comic move. But my father was an avid boxer and tried to convince all of his sons to become avid boxers, and I was terrible at it.
All right. Yeah. I can imagine growing up longing for your father and having all sorts of fantasies about what it would be like to have him, and then coming to America and go, oh, and here's the reality. So there's almost like, what was there like two dads, like the fantasy dad and then the one that you met?
Yeah.
Or were with?
What was strange was the dad that I met was so overwhelming in some ways. It was like a bomb that just destroyed everything that came before. I've got to tell you, the idealized father that I dreamed about. I can't even remember what I dreamed about. I know that I do have very distinct memories of fantasizing about seeing my father coming up the street. And even though I wouldn't have been able to recognize him in my fantasies, of course, I would know that this would be my father. This was a dream, a daydream, and a dream that I had repeatedly. The reality was very, very different. I was perhaps the wrong son for him in a way. I was very, very sensitive, very, very curious, and had grown up around a lot of adults, which meant that, I would, for better or for worse, I had a comfort with adults that perhaps an authoritarian figure like him did not really wish to see. I could still remember that, with my father, he was of that generation, of that world where if you looked him in the eyes, that was considered a crime. I don't remember ever looking my father in the eyes the entire time we were together. It was a remarkable, really a kind of great Santini type of a childhood in a way.
My dog is suddenly deciding to say, "Where are you?" So I'll give him a moment.
Yeah.
But how do you think this shaped, like, so much of your work is around masculinity? So much of your work is around masculinity. how do you think this shaped it? What were you trying to work out or discover?
Yeah. I mean, I had a very curious experience, right? For the first 6 years, I was kind of allowed to grow and to, I was even though we were very poor from a very humble family in the Dominican Republic, my grandparents spoiled me to whatever extent that they could. It wasn't material, but it was emotional. And I just grew up the way I would grow up, the way certain children grow up. We just, our lessons are sometimes direct, they're sometimes indirect, but it felt certainly organic in a way. And part of that organicity, I would probably argue, had to do with my poor grandparents being so, older and tired. It wasn't as if they could really kind of,
Right.
really put the pattern on me, With my father, on the other hand, it was a 24/7, 7 days a week project to take these sons that he suddenly got, who in his mind weren't masculine enough. And for me, I actually was confronted with a make a man project from my father, make you into a man at a conscious age. Most people acquire their masculinity, they're unaware, they're innocent. It's only later they reflect on some of the screwed up lessons that get passed on to us. But for me, it was like this explicit project. And it certainly began earlier, but just was so explicit and concrete and programmatic. And it made me very, very aware. Listen, most of the stuff that people consider hegemonic masculinity, I can remember being installed in me. I can remember my father absolutely pushing this, insisting on this, driving me to the point where I would break and finally accept, the way a kidnapped victim accepts the kind of the logic of their kidnapper. And I think this is where my interest in these kinds of militarized masculinities, dictatorial masculinities comes from, because I didn't just grow up in that water. That water came much later. I had a completely different perspective this first 6 years of my life. And that perspective saved me and made me curious.
Yeah. One of the things I often see is so many people who are here to create paradigm change, who are here to have a voice for change, often have an experience of living in two worlds. Whether it's literally two countries, two families, if you grew up black in a white community, but then got a divorce and ended up in a black community, and you were too white for the black kids, but too black for the white, there's often this piece of multiple worlds that get us a perspective on a world that other people don't have.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm hearing here.
Yeah, I think most of us have inhabited multiple worlds. Some of us, for whatever reason, we become curious or we narrativize it. You could take anyone who seems they're like, oh, I've been in the same place, been in the same town my whole life. You don't have to push the interview very far before you realize, wow, there's more than one world here. But not everyone's curious. Why do I say this, Jeffrey? I have 4 other siblings. If you talk to my other siblings, 3 of whom I immigrated with, they would tell you, what 2 worlds?
Right.
They completely didn't narrativize this the way I do. They really don't.
Yeah. Yeah. In your writing and in your activist work, what are you trying to get at or point to around masculinity as, a heteronormative masculinity?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things that interest me, right? I'm not certain that I have, and I don't hear you saying this, but I'm not certain I have any kind of messages. What I am is very curious about certain kinds of conversations. And, certain kinds of conversations that really, really interest me is the ways that hegemonic masculinity is such a misery-making project, both in the bearer of that masculinity, right? The person who's carrying it within them, and for the communities and families and networks who have to endure that kind of masculinity. And but it's that kind of strange internal realm where someone is tyrannized by the very ideology that they enable has always made me very curious that the privilege of masculinity for some is just so important that it doesn't matter that the damn thing is killing them. You
Right.
know, it's like the high of it
Yeah.
is more important. There's something very narcotic about it. Certainly, there's that element. I'm very, very curious about how one can develop. How does one develop an actual human point of view inside of such a kind of oppressive regime? Is it even possible? And that's another area, that's another conversation that I'm always trying to have. There's this idea, and you've heard this, right? There's a lot of debate around, can men be feminist, right? Certainly, you know that there's plenty of people who've already settled that debate within themselves. They're like, yes, men can be feminists. There's a part of me that as an artist is much more likely to say that, I think masculine privilege as currently formulated certainly makes that far more challenging than any declaration of allegiance would lead one to believe. And so here are the conversations. And for someone like me who's of African descent and an immigrant, I wrap these sort of dialogues inside of those enormous complexities.
When you were 9, I believe it was, you were raped. Is that right?
Yes.
Like diving into
Yeah, a
that.
little bit. That's
I read your New Yorker article, which moved me really deeply. And we're talking about masculinity, and I'm wondering how, like, what, that's 3 years into moving to this country, being with your father. How did that shift things for you?
oof. I mean, I think that in one way or the other, the person that I was, the young person that I was before, was certainly not the young person that I became after. You know, I just think it's sort of a remarkable thing. And just again, I'm kind of thinking I was actually 8 years old, and
Okay.
I think what's sort of like I would say what was extraordinary about that, and to use that word, extraordinary is in like in the most negative connotation, is that, look, I immigrated. I know what it's like to lose your kind of covenant with the world, right? Whatever I understood about the world suddenly had to be completely reevaluated and rebuilt after I immigrated. Everything from language to even how you hold your body, yeah, what you smell, what you taste. It's incredible how much changes when you immigrate and how little we understand that process. After I was 8 years old, after I was raped, it was my entire sense, not only of the world, but my entire sense of any sort of dreams and illusions of safety that one carries with one as a child. I certainly did. I certainly felt that there was There was ways that I was safe and ways that I was secure. All of that went out the window. All of it went out the window. It took me, I think, almost my entire adult life to reestablish a sense of security, to reestablish a sense that the world wasn't only a predatorial prospect. And, as an artist, especially as a literary writer, we live in a culture of, round the clock confession. But for me, there was nothing more difficult than that. I ended up having to write literally 3 books before I could finally begin to approach the sort of the core injury, because the silence was so complete and the agony was so overwhelming and the fear was just, it had a remarkably powerful hold on me.
Yeah. How'd you wrestle with that?
Well, there's
The
positive and
fear and
negative.
getting through the fear and
Positive and negative, some of it was I was for many years, but until I got a back injury, I was a very serious runner. I ran, not like these Olympic folks. I didn't do marathons, but I was getting there to 7, 8 miles a day. It was a way of kind of like managing, a form of medication. More negative would be, boy, did I really like to drink? I drank quite a lot, and I always feel glad I didn't, get into a car accident or anything like that. But yeah, there's both positive and negative. The other aspect, of course, is that for me at least, that there was an experience that predated this, which was very powerful. I had my grandparents. I had this relationship that I was able to keep alive in my heart, and they were very spiritual people. They were people who were strongly Catholic, taught me a lot about faith, and taught me a lot about that this world is mysterious and this world isn't simple, and this world isn't always joyful, but that there is wonder, and that there is all manners of healing and learning that are possible no matter what situation you're in. And I think that helped quite a lot. I mean, I clung to my grandparents' memory and to what they meant to me through every trouble I've ever suffered.
yeah. W- Did you always know you were going to tell this
No,
story? Or was it like,
absolutely
no,
not.
hell no, no,
No,
no?
I thought that I could live a full life by just skirting it and never, you know, never having to really go in.
When did that when did that change?
I think it changed for me when I was basically a decade into the decade before I wrote that essay. I had spent probably 2/3 of that decade in 2/3 of it, I would say would be, I think would be fair, 2/3 in a really deep depression. Just depressed all the time, plenty of suicidal ideation, couldn't write worth a damn. And there's nothing worse than having kind of a public, no matter how small and how narrow, to have a kind of, to be quote unquote failing in public, right? Not able to write your book, taking years and years and years. And, I had friends of mine who knew what had happened and who had been telling me year after year after year, saying the same thing. They're like, listen, if you don't bear witness to this some way, this thing is going to eat you alive, period. And, I used to think, well, that's what you say. We'll see if I can, get through this and kind of overcome it. But the depressions got so deep, the kind of suicidal ideation became so alluring, and I needed an answer. I needed to do something. And it was strange how long it took me to come around to this blueprint, right? This door that my friends had been pointing out for years. But the
Yeah.
struggle, the internal struggle was so powerful. And, you know, all of my resistance and my fears just were such obstacles that it took forever for me to understand what my friends were saying and to finally avail myself of the obvious.
A lot of the people that, like, one of the core themes of the people that I tend to work with is that they've all got to come out about something. You know, I think part of my, what I call my life PhD, growing up as a gay kid from a fundamentalist house in the Midwest, right? Like, I know that lane. And I'm curious when it comes to this story, because one of my favorite Brene Brown quotes is, "Until you own your story owns you." And a lot of times we have stories that we need to own that are really, really, really difficult to own, you know, especially if they involve other people, especially if there are secrets. When it comes to the fears you had of sharing that story, were they fears about other people, fears about your own identity? I'm sure a mixture of all of these things, but like where would you point, like, this was the thing I really had to confront?
I think there was so much shame involved. And there was this sense that, you know, there was kind of a deep fear and a kind of a more surface run, right? In a sense, and I'm sure, like you pointed out, there's a lot more than that, and it's not easily divvied up, but in a way that I can talk about it, I think that there was a deep fear that going anywhere near it would put me back in it. I think this, you see this, it's common. People are so terrified to
Yeah.
approach the wound because they're afraid that the wound will then, the wound that they had escaped, they thought would consume them. When in fact, it's the exact opposite. The wound's been consuming you all along, and the only escape is by bearing witness to it. And then the second thing, I think, was that I had constructed a mask and spent so many years with a mask. And the mask was that this had never happened. And I had no idea who I would be without that mask. You know, I had no idea if I could
Yeah.
even be a person. Like, that mask had given me my personhood. It had been that which helped me survive. And, you know, it wasn't clearly helping me survive anymore. And in fact, was making me less likely to survive. But at that time, I did not think that being without it, that was a viable option. And so I think that there was a lot of fear that, in fact, you know, I would be completely unraveled by this revelation.
There's a quote from the New York article. He said about a girl you were dating: "The longer we were together, the more her family loved me, the more unbearable it got. There was only so much closeness a person like me could endure before I needed to fly the fuck away." So that to me is the very thing
Yeah.
you're speaking to
No,
here.
eternal, like, again, the
Yeah.
eternal loneliness. Because I think, you know, when you think about why is a person depressed, certainly the actual event is so traumatic. But the management of the event produces such alienation and such loneliness. You know, I was able to leverage the loneliness and become a writer, right? Because you've got to be able to withstand just social deprivation to become a writer. And many of us do it for different reasons. But the loneliness just was, for someone like me, it just was just terrible. It was just so terrible. That kind of distance between myself and anyone around me, you know, constantly fleeing, even if I was standing there smiling. It just was so much.
Yeah. What? So that was published in what, 2018? What has changed for you since writing that piece? Like, internally, your own experience, or maybe also your experience as a artist.
It's hard to say. I mean, I think, you know, I wish these things were more like Hollywood, where, these resolutions were crisp and they're narratively dynamic and they're easy to put your finger on. It's really hard to say. On the one hand,
Yeah.
there's no question it did me a world of good. On the other hand, your one is always a work in progress. You know, I've still wrestled with an enormous amount of depression. I still wrestle with a lot of the stuff that I was wrestling with before. Hopefully, this makes those periods of depression less and less. I know that, you know, I know that I no longer have the nightmares that I used to have. I used to have just constant, awful, just nightmares. You know, in some ways, re-experiencing the trauma through 1,000 different ways. And I am no longer tormented by those. And just if that was the only thing that I gained at a conscious level, it was well worth, you know, all the suffering that brought me to it.
Yeah. I want to thank you, by the way. Thank you. You wrote an article in Complex, and well, there's a line that really popped out to me, and I'm curious how you dance with this, because so many of the people I work with have this, like, I'm here to do a thing, but doesn't matter. And the line here is, you ain't fucking relevant. You don't fucking cure shit. You don't fucking employ people. Right? Your work as an artist, finding value in your work as an artist. And I'm curious, like, this relationship between I'm here, like, as an artist, do you find that I'm here to just express my voice? Are you here to bring something to the world? Like, how do you dance with that relevance?
But I think that there's, again, different people, as you know, have very different sets of operating, you know, procedures. And we all have our own homebrew system for how we get through this wild ass life. And, you know, our philosophies are part of that homebrew system. I think it's been very, very important for me to constantly remind myself what it means to approach humility. What are some of the dangers of grandiosity? A lot of times, you know, it's so easy to be grandiose and to be arrogant or proud. It's just so easy. And because I know how easy it is, for me at least, I kind of keep myself in a conversation around humility, reminding, as I always say, shrinking myself to the appropriate size for a couple of reasons. I don't think that a sense of power, a sense of status is good for humans. It's just not good for human beings interacting with each other. It's not good for humanity. It does not bring out the best in people. You know, one, right? But also, it is important for us to have a dialogue with ourselves, you know, and not to be convinced of our virtues. You know, my growing up, my friends were always saying he's a very humble person. Cool, I could become convinced of my virtues, but I'm not really that interested in being convinced of my virtues. I'm interested in constantly dialoguing with myself to see if I have any virtues at all, which I think is, it's a more proper stance, you know. And then, of course, as an artist, why this really, really matters is because, look, humanity's capacity for self-deception is limitless. And as an artist, if you can't get a handle on that, I think it makes for very weak art. Very, very weak art, at least from my point of view. You know, I'm so much more interested in reminding myself that ultimately, how many writers have I seen pass, You read the newspaper, a writer passes, you go to the bookstore, and they're no longer stocking their books. Writers who were incredibly important to a generation, and now one has to go to the library. And you'll be lucky if you find their books at the library. And the realization is that, listen, we're not here for long. What in the world is these ideas of grandiosity, these ideas of some kind of I'm going to be Titanic? Of what help are they to anyone? They certainly aren't a help to me. I write far better art, from the point of view of I'm just another ant, than I write from the point of view of I've got this or that or this or that and whatever I want, or whatever blankets of achievement, and of spurious, status I wish to, wrap myself in.
I know for myself, when I get caught up in status, it is the fastest path to alienation.
My God. How do you connect with anyone? And it's funny because I speak Spanish well enough. I know my friends were completely fluent or laughing. They're like, blah, he don't speak well at all. But I speak well enough, hold conversations, etc. But because my Spanish is nowhere near as strong as my English, what's kind of fascinating, I cannot deploy any of the tricks, right? I cannot be smart. I cannot be rhetorically slick. In fact, when I speak Spanish, in some ways, it's so much a better person because I cannot depend on any of the quote unquote linguistic power tools that I've had in English. And I see that very, very closely. Like when I watch myself and I observe myself in Spanish, I'm always like, man, you do so much better when you can't be even remotely clever.
Yeah. When I saw that conversation you had with Peter Sagal, and you guys were talking about you being a geek growing up. I can't help but think about your upbringing and wanting to escape it, and being a geek and exploring different worlds, and how that would build perhaps a linguistic prowess.
My God. At least it did in me. It doesn't necessarily in everyone, but yeah, for me, definitely. I mean, it was great because, my parents were, my parents had a certain kind of education, they had a certain kind of social and cultural capital. My parents didn't understand that my geekly interest, my nerdy interests in Dungeons and Dragons and in reading science fiction books, they didn't understand that was, in fact, not scholarly, that couldn't lead to academic success. In their mind, wow, it's got words, it's printed, this is this kid being smart. And not this kid running from...
He's reading.
Exactly. And that allowed me in this family like mine to get away with it. Because my mom would see me, reading a thick Isaac Asimov book, and she'd be like, oh, yeah, the kid's being smart. And I'm over here like, yeah, the 3 laws of robotics, I'm in,
Oh, that is so awesome. I'm kind of fascinated at the beauty. So with all of our wounding, right? There's tremendous darkness, and then I'm always looking for the unexpected beauty, the unexpected gift, and listening to you share a bit about your life and thinking about. I love your writing, and the worlds that you get into, and they're so fine, they're like fine, like a grain of sand, and that your whole life set you up to explore worlds, your own, but also to create worlds and to invent worlds. When you look at quote unquote our world, as somebody that Like even in this conversation, you strike me even more deeply as somebody that does that both introspection, personal introspection, but also that really curious look at this world. There's one of the conversations I was watching with you. You were talking about, you know, American anti-intellectualism, and this is before
Sure.
Trump. You know, and you were talking about what did we do? Well, we hired an Ivy Leaguer whose dad was an Ivy Leaguer who did the darndest, you know, aw shucks, good old boy routine there was. In the last 4 or 5 years, what have you been noticing? Like, what's not even that you necessarily know what the hell is going on, but like, what have you been looking at?
I mean, I've been looking at the fact that we begin this conversation talking about climate change, right? I think before we jumped on, you know, we were thinking about and having a little chat about climate change. And one of the things that's pretty obvious is that been a long time, I imagined, since we've had this much planetary peril to what we might describe as human civilization. Never in our history have we needed more desperately than we need now collective imaginaries, the ability of people to work together. This is when we most need collective civic imaginaries. We need the ability to kind of put down nonsense and be able to get to it, roll up the sleeves. You know, okay, so what? You're a Yankees fan, I'm a Mets fan, or whatever the hell it is. Put it down. There's a fire. We have to put out the fire. One of the things that I've noticed, and this is, of course, outcome of the kind of neoliberal atomization compounded by the disinvestment in education, adding to the ways that social media dehumanize us and polarize us. What we have a situation right now is that not only have we never been in more trouble and in more danger, but I've never seen people less able to do collective activity. So just really quickly, I teach a class on apocalyptic storytelling, right? End of the world stuff. Now, I was teaching Steven Soderbergh's film Contagion. I was teaching this film 2 years before the pandemic, and then I taught it after the pandemic. And you know what my students tell me? They're like, man, the biggest piece of science fiction in this entire class was not the Road Warrior, was not like alien invasion. It was the moment in Contagion where people are happy to line up for their vaccine. He imagines, Soderbergh imagines this world where, a chunk of the planet dies off with a plague. But in his mind, people would be willing to line up and for a cure, but we've discovered that that's not the case. We can't even do that. This is simple stuff. I'm not trying to say that 1 million people dead in the United States is simple stuff. That is an agony which we will wrestle with for centuries. Believe it. While we don't want to recognize now, that is. But the fact that we couldn't even face that without our society almost coming undone, it's very ominous. It's very, very ominous. And how quickly we become radicalized around issues we never even thought about 5 minutes before. So
Isn't that
I
fascinating?
think that, this is more than ever why it's, and as is my kind of take, it's more than ever why those of us who don't exist in that realm, who haven't fallen for that crap, we've got to keep fighting, because we've got to keep whatever light there is in this moment alive. It's darker out there than it looks. Something my grandfather used to say to me. This was a farmer, He would look out over his field and it said, it's darker out there than it looks. And I take that and I'm thinking, like, at a societal level, let's move the dark away from it and say it's grimmer out there than it looks. And therefore, we have to keep fighting and fight as hard as we can to keep alive the ideas of contemplation, the keep alive spaces of deliberation, slow people's zones down so that, people get into a realm of slow thinking, which is what we're going to need. This whole fast thinking, fast judgment, all of this stuff is just brutally unhelpful.
I'm just thinking about this slowing down piece and slow thinking. I have a client right now who is working on he's a real estate developer, but he's working on a whole new vision for real estate that helps people slow down, that allows their biology and physiology and psychology to slow down, to lock in. One of the places I was curious for you to explore is stepping out, being a hermit, getting quiet, going away, and stepping in, stepping forward, bringing your voice out, being public, and the dance between those two.
Yeah. I think
What's that been like
I think
for
it's
you?
interesting because I definitely look. If you want attention, you would write more than one book every 12 or 15 years. Believe me, it's not that tough to write a book. I don't mean to diminish what I do, but certainly if I was compelled for attention, it would not take me as long to write a book. I find my art in these long stretches of silence, in these long stretches where whatever public face I have falls away. Some of us, it's important for some of us to have to dive deep before we get anything. Other folks, they can be out there all day and do enormously valuable work and can even deepen themselves in the middle of that, that pell-mell chaos, right? They could come into contact with things that really matter in their hearts and in society. You think of someone like Paul Varmer, someone who's incredibly active, very, very human, very humane, deepened from what I could see their entire, adult life. I go a different way. I definitely need the silence of this whole society, the silence of this whole world to recede before I can hear anything that I would want to bring to anyone as news. I mean, that's what we artists do. I mean, beyond everything else, we bring news of the world, but the only time I can uncover any news of the world worthy of repetition, right, or circulation is when everything goes quiet for a very long period of time.
How do you do that for yourself?
I think I first take a long time to work. And, one of the great things about me, I have certain advantages, right? I only teach one semester a year. Great. So I've got 8 months off. The other thing is that none of my close friends are writers or artists or belong to this academic literary complex. All my friends are like, they're Dominicans. One guy runs a restaurant. Another guy runs a construction company. Another guy's a history teacher. Another guy he's a surgeon. None of them are sitting around talking to me about agents or advances or who wrote what or what's going on. Did you see what was in this week's Sunday book review? I have organized my life to, in some ways, be utterly insulated from my own practice, from my own quote unquote career. And that has been helpful. Not everybody can do that. And the other thing is that I actually belong to a practice that is itself hermetic. I belong to the practice of literacy. And as long as I'm reading, I've got a built-in excuse of why I'm not in here reading Twitter, or why I'm not like trying to figure out what the next NFT is, or, I'm so busy reading darn books, packing in the muscle that I'm going to need to write this, next text, that I don't have much time, reading. Being a serious reader is like being a parent, and a real parent, a good parent. What good parent has any time? And if you're a good parent, chances are you've got no time for anything. And it's the same thing. If you're a serious reader, it helps me. It keeps me away from the frivolity. It keeps me away from my own worst nonsense of distraction. When you read a book that was written 100 years ago that somebody went to prison for, right? And you encounter in that book a felicitous sentence that has spoken to you over the gulf of time. I don't know. There's something to that that's really quite beautiful. And at least for me, numinous. And I think that helps. But yeah, the reading does a lot for me. Again, organizing my life the way I did a lot for me. And then being strict with myself, because look, if you have any success in anything you do, there is always a group of people happy to, big or small, happy to give you applause. Ain't nothing messed a person up more in the world than applause and the lust for applause. So, as long as I kind of keep reminding myself, and keep an eye on myself not to fall for the applause, in myself, that helps as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you added that. I know sometimes buying what I'm selling is one of the slipperiest slopes I can be on. Where do you see the role of artists now?
Yeah, it's so hard to say. It is so hard to say. Absolutely necessary, clearly. The arts, we have not yet fashioned a greater technology for putting the human inside of us in conversation with itself. Whether it's a painting, music, dance, reading, that's it. That's what art does best. It puts the human inside of us in conversation with itself. Now, clearly, it uses transitional objects, a book, an actor, but ultimately, it puts us in conversation with this humanity, which we so little understand and appreciate even less. So incredibly essential, indispensable for our civilization. On the other hand, globalized neoliberal capital has done everything to bankrupt, co-opt, and contaminate the artist and the idea of artistry. It's so wild how easy it is to be a corporate shill, even when you're supposed to be a serious artist. There's so many invitations for that. And there's also so many invitations for you to partake in the lunacies of this society. This society has a lot of lunacies. I think we're all aware of them. And the kind of just wearying, polarized thinking that this society has encouraged everyone to imbibe. A lot of artists have fallen for it. Which is not to say that one doesn't have a political stand, but the kind of media-driven, technologically driven polarization that has left us completely bereft of, collective possibilities. I would argue that this is not a good idea. No matter how mad you are at Trump, or how mad you are if you're from the other side at Antifa, or whatever the hell, leftist nightmares haunts the imaginaries of the right. Ultimately, what it comes down to as an artist is that, listen, neoliberal capital is powerful. It colonizes worse than the Borg. And groups that used to say and would argue that they stood outside of it are now even more vulnerable to it. And it matters quite a lot that the people that used to create these wonderful spaces for people to encounter themselves and to encounter what is human. It matters quite a lot that those people are under threat and being co-opted and become more and more tributes of capital. That's a great loss to all of us.
What's your, right now we're in, week 3 of this war in Ukraine. We talked a little bit about before we started, how deeply people are like, oh, this isn't going to happen. Here we are. If there was a hope or a vision you had for artists at this point in history and moving forward, what would it be?
I mean, look, for me,
or maybe for yourself as an artist.
For me, I have enormous amount of hope because look, if it was up to TikTok and Twitter, no one would have read a book for the last 4 years. The fact that we have read so many books, that so many of us continue to read, that so many of us read newspapers, that so many of us read seriously, that so many of us engage in theater, that so many of us engage in sculpture, that so many of us are serious about dance, I think is an enormous tribute to how the arts, despite being attacked on all sides, continues to live and in certain areas thrive. All I can say is that, look, we've got great defenders in the arts, and we've got great people who have made art center to their life. We're very fortunate because if it was up to the folks who, want to colonize that with 2-second video clips, we wouldn't exist. I think ultimately the future, and I think it's so hard to imagine what a future is, but the future, we're never, ever going to look back on these artists and the ones who helped us endure these hard times and ever feel that they've not done their jobs. As long as artists keep doing their jobs, resist turning into, some kind of shrill, Twitter bot or some, lunatical corporate spokesperson, as long as we keep doing our job, which is to really get in there with what it is to be human, I actually think that no matter how badly we're eroded, we'll be able to hold our head up high and we will have done what we were placed on this planet to do. And this work, even if it spends the next 20 years being diminished and misunderstood and disrespected, is going to save us. It is going to save us. I believe that.
So good. So good. I'm going to close with this quote from you. This is from and I've never known how to pronounce this, The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar. Wow.
Yeah, that's it.
Great. There we go. But if these years have taught me anything, it's this. You can never run away, not ever. The only way out is in. So, thank you for your time. Thank you for your voice. Thanks for continuing to stand up and be a part of bringing light to this world. I do believe that the only way out is in, and I have great hope for how this time can propel us to new questions, new inquiries, and new paths forward. So,
well, Jeffrey, I appreciate you so much. Thank you. Take good care.
Hey there, thanks so much for listening in. If this conversation was powerful, if it stirred your soul or inspired your journey, then be sure to share it with a friend. Just copy and paste the link wherever you're listening to this podcast and text that link right now to a friend that you think would be inspired by this episode. And if this is your first time here, be sure to click that subscribe button over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a rating and review so I can get to know you and your thoughts better. To learn more about the work I do with emerging and established paradigm changers, go to thecourageousmessenger.com. That's all for today. Thanks so much for being here, and I hope to see you in the next episode.